Okay, so my video production has slowed down a bit. The main projects that I've been working on are taking a lot longer than I would like. I have a big retrospective about Star Trek video games that I'm working on, which has bloated in scope and size and is going on for weeks and possibly months, alongside the long-promised video about a particular tabletop board game, which is now past due by almost a full year. I finally was able to play a few matches of that tabletop game over the summer to record footage, so I can finally go into full production of that particular project. As for the Star Trek retrospective, that may end up becoming a multi-part essay. A preview clip of one part of that Star Trek project is already available to my patrons. In the meantime, I want to give my 2 cents on a topic that was brought up in an episode of the Jimquisition a couple months ago. It's something that I have strong opinions about and is directly related to my gaming habits and content creation, so hopefully I have a worthwhile perspective about this topic, and this discussion might also give my viewers a little bit of a peek under the hood of my content creation and insight into how I play and review games. The issue at question is whether video game reviewers should be obligated to finish a video game to completion before reviewing it. The answer to that question is a resounding, absolute, unequivocal no. Okay, well thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and become a patron if you would like to see more videos like this detailed, exhaustive piece of content that took me forever to put together. Alright, in all seriousness now, as an amateur who plays games and creates written reviews and video essays, all on my free time outside of a full-time job, I cannot possibly play every game to end credits, let alone to 100% completion or a platinum trophy. But you know what? Neither do most players. Go ahead, take a look at the achievement or trophy metrics for any game that you play. You'll probably find that the achievement for beating almost any game will be owned by well below half of all players, and might actually be less than 10% for many longer games like RPGs. And while there are certainly some players who play offline and don't report their stats to Steam, Microsoft, Sony, or Nintendo, the achievement stats for the vast overwhelming majority of games is very closely representative of the population, since most players don't go to the trouble of playing off the grid. So finishing a game is a relatively rare thing for the average gamer to do, which means the average gamer isn't going to care if a particular review finished the game or not. The average gamer is probably not going to see the end of the game anyway, so a review that only covers the first half or so of the game will still be perfectly adequate and informative for such a player. So, as an average gamer who plays as a hobby and writes reviews and other content on the side, as an unpaid amateur, that's good enough for me too. Yes, I will try to finish the main campaign of a game that I review. For most shorter games with campaigns less than 20 hours, I do indeed almost always hit the end credits before I publish a review. It'll usually take me a couple weeks to do it, which is why even if I bought the game on release day, my reviews will still be several weeks late or longer. Most of my reviews are practically retro reviews by the time I get them out. Again, this is because I'm an amateur reviewer who does all my playing and reviewing outside of a full-time, non-video gaming job. I don't get free review copies of games, and I certainly don't get early press releases to play before the game even comes out. I buy the games, retail, with my own money after they release to the general public, just like everybody else. Well, sometimes I also wait a week or two and I buy the game used if I don't want to give the money to the publisher. But this amateur status also does have its perks. I'm not beholden to embargoes, nor do I have to worry about being blacklisted if I write a negative review, which has happened to James Stephanie Sterling and to other professional critics. I also don't have to sign NDAs prohibiting me from discussing potential spoilers. I'm free to spoil a game to my heart's content if that spoiler dramatically affected my perception of the game, or if I think the game is not worth playing and I'm actively trying to spoil it in order to deter my audience from playing it. I'm also not pressured to rush through a game in order to get a review out by release day. I'm free to take my time, really soak up the game, and give my honest thoughts after plenty of time for deliberation. If it takes me a month to play enough of a game to feel comfortable reviewing it, then I'll write a review after a month. As an independent creator with my own blog, I'm also free to go back and update my written reviews. video essays are, of course, a lot more difficult to go back and change. So if my opinions of a game change upon further reflection, or if I posted a review prematurely and my opinion does change as a result of going back and finishing the game, or if the game itself changed due to post-release patches or updates, I can and have gone back and revised my reviews. I've either updated the old reviews with my new opinions, or I've written completely new reviews that link back to the original. Professional game critics often don't have that luxury. That's also a big benefit of making written reviews instead of video reviews. It's a lot easier to add a couple paragraphs to a web page than to re-edit and re-upload a video. But even for a full-time professional reviewer, being expected to finish a game before reviewing it might also be an unrealistic expectation. Most reviewers are expected to review at least one new game each week. A full-time work week is 40 hours. Working more than that should be rare, especially if the employee isn't being paid extra for those extra hours. If a company expects an employee to work 60 hours or more in a week on a regular basis or without additional compensation, that is just flat out abusive and toxic, and those employees should probably quit with extreme prejudice. Anyway, back when big budget games had 10 to 40-ish hour campaign playtimes as the standard, finishing a whole game to the end of that main campaign within a week was perfectly realistic. But now that more and more games have shifted towards being live services or having 60-hour or 100-hour or longer campaigns, the idea of finishing that game's campaign in a single 40-hour work week is no longer realistic, even for a full-time professional reviewer. Even with overtime, a full-time reviewer cannot be realistically expected to finish such a long game in a single work week. Not even close. And that says nothing about having to play through the campaign on multiple difficulties, or with multiple playable characters, or to get different endings if the game supports any of those things. A game like Dark Souls or Elden Ring may take 40 to 60 hours for a first playthrough, but that's just with one character build and achieving one of multiple endings. A reviewer with a melee build might spend the entire workweek grinding out the game through the final boss and end credits, but never even engage with systems like magic or stealth. And that's assuming that the game even has a single campaign with a defined start and finish. Epic scale games like Civilization, Crusader Kings, City Skylines, and so forth could take much longer. A reviewer of Civilization might spend 20 hours playing a single faction's campaign through to a victory screen. But that's just one faction out of like 20 factions that the game might have shipped with, each with its own unique gameplay mechanics and associated strategies. And that one campaign might have been played on an easy difficulty level like Warlord or Prince. If you expect that reviewer to complete a campaign with all 20 or so civilizations, each of which is probably going to take 10 hours or longer, that would easily be over 200 hours, which is, hold on, let me do the math. Let's see, carry the 1, divide by pi, multiply by c squared. Yeah, that's a little bit longer than one work week. In fact, it's longer than a work month. The same can be said about a game like the upcoming Cities Skylines 2. City builders are more of a free-form sandbox game. Will I have finished Cities Skylines 2 and be allowed to review it after I've grown a single city up to the final milestone? Is 100,000 population sufficient for completing the game? Or will I need to build 2 cities, or 10 cities, or build a city on every map? And then there's procedural games like The Binding of Isaac, Spelunky, Terraria, FTL, and so forth. These games have randomized content that a player may not experience in a single playthrough. What about games like Minecraft or The Sims that doesn't even necessarily have a formal win state? Or competitive online games like Call of Duty or Fortnite that are meant to be played and replayed indefinitely? Is it fair for a reviewer to play a single match of Hell Let Loose and then write a scathing review about how hard the game is and how he couldn't take more than 10 steps without being headshot by an enemy across a field that he couldn't even see? I mean, the reviewer completed a game, right? Or should that reviewer have to level up every single class to max and play every class with every faction on every map? And does that reviewer need to win all of those matches for it to count? Hell, what even is complete for games like those? For those kinds of games, I usually spend months playing them and trying to get a good feel for them before I have the courage to write a review. And even then, I will still find that there are things that I miss in those games after further play. Things that I wish I'd talked about in the review. Thankfully, I don't have publication deadlines, so I can play on my own pace and release the review whenever it's ready, even if it is 6 months after the game's launch. And as I said before, I can also edit it later if I feel that's necessary. And this brings me to another key point. A reviewer doesn't need to play an entire game through to completion. Instead, the reviewer only needs to play a representative sample of the game in order to write a representative review. Sure, the definition of representative sample is up for debate, and reasonable people may disagree about what qualifies as representative, but art, by its very nature, is subjective. A reviewer can only communicate their own experience with the material. Well, unless the reviewer is a corporate shill who just regurgitates the publisher's marketing material and propaganda, in which case they don't even have to play the game at all anyway, so what good is their review? So each person is going to have a different standard for what constitutes a representative sample. Case in point, if a person plays Demon's Souls for an hour and gives up because the game is too hard and they aren't enjoying themselves, that person is more than welcome to write a review and say that they didn't enjoy the game. That review is surely going to be useful to someone.
I felt the best way to review Demon's Souls would be to simply describe my entire experience, so in conclusion, fuck you, Demon's Souls. A challenge is...
Players who don't have the patience or the time for such a grueling game will know to stay away from it. Yeah, sure, that reviewer might miss the reward and satisfaction of conquering that challenge, and yeah, that's a shame, because I think Demon's Souls is a very good game. But you know what? Most of the people who would benefit from that review probably wouldn't stick with the game long enough to get to that point anyway. And nobody should feel obligated to subject themselves to grinding dozens of hours of a game that they don't actually enjoy playing. A good reviewer knows their audience, and writes to that audience. If you disagree with the reviewer's review of a game, it doesn't necessarily mean that the reviewer didn't get the game, or didn't play enough of it, or that they're a liar, or a hater, or a shill, or that they're too woke, or not woke enough, or whatever else you might want to accuse them of being. It might just be that the reviewer is addressing an honest, heartfelt review to their specific audience, and maybe you aren't part of that audience. So coming back to the question at hand, I am an amateur blogger, YouTuber, and game critic. I'm in my late 30s. I'm also a parent, and I work a full-time job, and I have other hobbies and obligations, both personal and professional. If I'm lucky, I get a few hours a night to play games, and maybe a little more on the weekend. Sometimes things work out so that I don't get to play any video games for a whole week because I just have other shit going on. Like a baby crying in the background because I won't let him sit on my lap and smash buttons on the keyboard while I'm recording. That is the perspective from which I approach video games, and it's the experience that informs my reviews and critiques. I tailor my reviews to people in similar circumstances, people who have real-world obligations, and who have limited time and budget to play games. If you're a 14-year-old living in your mom's basement and using her credit card and have nothing to do all day after school except play Madden Ultimate Team, to the point that you can call 15 defensive audibles and hot routes within the 4 seconds that it takes the CPU to snap the ball, then my Madden reviews are not for you. Maybe you might still get something out of them, I don't know. At the very least, you might better understand someone else's perspective on the game and its supposed flaws and strengths. But at the end of the day, my Madden review, which will probably be published in late September or early October anyway, isn't going to sway your purchase decision. But it does not make my review any less valid. And this is all assuming an ideal launch for a game, which is a big assumption. Most video games these days, especially the big budget ones, release with a multitude of bugs and problems that have to be patched in the coming weeks or months. Someone who rushes through the game on release day, or before, isn't going to be playing a version of the game that most players will be playing later on down the road. Hell, nowadays, we even have publishers who will deliberately withhold content, such as microtransaction stores, so that mainstream media reviewers can't complain about a pay-to-win economy or exploitative loot boxes, and so that the ESRB can't put disclaimers on the box warning parents of such features. And then they patch in such content a week or two after the game's release. So once again, I ask, what constitutes completing a game? If I 100% complete the game and earn a platinum trophy within a day or two of the game releasing, and I write a supposedly objective review based on my completion of the game, but then a week later the publisher patches in a pay-to-win microtransaction economy and completely rebalances the game's progression systems and pacing, then does it even matter that I completed the game? At that point, my review is no more relevant than the review of someone who played for an hour. And what if a game is horribly buggy, unstable, and incomplete at launch? A reviewer might complete that version of the game and write a negative review that reflects the state of the game at release. But then the developer might spend weeks or months or even years updating the game until it's eventually good. And those updates might not only be bug fixes. Those changes may include substantive changes to the game itself, including rebalancing of mechanics, new levels or quests, completely new game systems or modes of play, and so forth. Just look at a game like No Man's Sky. It was panned at release, including by myself, for being unstable and lacking features that the lead developer kept promising, or at least implying, would be in the game. But after years of updates and new features, the general consensus seems to be that, yeah, No Man's Sky is actually pretty good now, and is much closer to living up to the expectations that it had at its release. It has a wider variety of alien worlds and biomes to explore. It has the promised multiplayer and faction-based space battles. It has the ability to craft your own custom spaceships, planetary bases, and space stations. It has the ability to easily return to places you've already explored, including places on which you've built custom structures. None of that was in the game when it released. So did anybody who actually played the game at release even truly complete No Man's Sky? And hell, what about the people who liked No Man's Sky back when it first launched? Because there were people like that. The game they liked? That game doesn't even exist anymore. And heck, what about a more recent example, like Cyberpunk 2077? Is that game good now? An example that hits a bit closer to home for me personally was Civilization V. That game was kind of a mess when it first released. It was painfully slowly paced and horribly balanced. It took 6 months of post-release patches for Firaxis to even start to get it to a point that it felt truly good to play. And it didn't get really good until the first expansion, Gods and Kings, released more than a year after that. So for any given video game, the game that I play on release day might not even be the same game that a reader might play 6 months or a year later. And to be perfectly frank, if the game's publisher cannot be bothered to finish developing the game before selling it, as is so often the case in today's release now, patch later culture, then why should I be obligated to finish playing the game before I review it? Long story short, no. A reviewer does not need to complete a game in order to write an informative review. And that is true regardless of whether the reviewer is a paid professional critic working full-time at an established media outlet, or if they are just a measly amateur with a blog and a YouTube channel. At the end of the day, any given reviewer is going to review the game based on the experience they had playing it and with the cultural and socio-political context of the time in which they played the game and wrote the review. No one should be expected to 100% complete games that are often, by design, supposed to provide endless content. No one should be expected to be able to give a 100% objective, unbiased opinion of a subjective artistic work. No one can be expected to be 100% accurate in a review of any product if the source material itself is literally changing every few weeks or months. Anyone who expects those things from a reviewer has unrealistic expectations. Thanks for watching.